They didn't know each other. They didn't speak the same language. And just days earlier, they had been enemies. But on May 5, 1945, in the crumbling heart of Nazi Austria, they stood shoulder to shoulder. American GIs, defected German soldiers, French prisoners, and resistance fighters, bound together by desperation, duty, and the will to survive. This is not a tale of glory earned in conquest. This is the story of a hilltop castle, a handful of men, and one of the most bizarre last stands in the history of war. It began in the shadows of defeat. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. But the guns hadn't gone silent, not everywhere. In the alpine village of ITTER, one final act of madness was unfolding. Perched high above the trees stood Castle ITTER, a medieval fortress repurposed into a Nazi prison. But not just any prison. Within its stone walls were France's most powerful voices, prime ministers, generals, resistance leaders, even celebrities, captured and held like trophies. Among them, Édouard Daladier, Paul Reynaud, Maurice Gamelin, Jean Borotra, the tennis star turned war captive, men of power stripped of it, now watching the Third Reich crack under its own weight. But with collapse came danger. The SS, fanatical remnants of Hitler's army, had gone rogue, untethered from orders, fueled by vengeance. They knew the war was lost, but they weren't done killing. Inside the castle, the prisoners waited, surrounded, trapped, and with no illusions about what would happen if help didn't arrive. Then came a spark. A prisoner named Zvonimir Chuchkovich, Yugoslav, resourceful, brave, slipped past the guards and into the forest. His mission, find the Americans. It was suicide. But somehow, he made it. Hours later, Captain John C. Jack Lee Jr. of the U.S. 12th Armored Division stood at a crossroads, literally and figuratively. His orders were clear: advance slowly, secure territory, avoid unnecessary risk. But the message Chuchkovich carried didn't leave room for hesitation. High-profile hostages, Nazi forces closing in, no time. Lee made a choice. He took what he had, one Sherman tank, a handful of men, and raced toward the castle. But he wasn't the only one watching the chaos unfold. Major Josef Gangl was Wehrmacht, German army, decorated, experienced, and deeply disillusioned. Gangl had turned his back on the Nazi regime and joined Austrian resistance fighters. He believed in honor, not ideology. And when he heard about the castle, he did the unthinkable. He offered to fight alongside the Americans. So there they were, Lee's armored cavalry, Gangl's defected Germans, Austrian partisans, and Czech laborers. An army of misfits with one goal: protect the prisoners. They reached Castle ITTER just in time. The SS were already massing in the forests below, over 100 of them, armed with heavy machine guns, rifles, and an 88mm artillery piece aimed directly at the fortress. Lee parked his tank, nicknamed Besotten Jenny, at the castle gate. Then he took stock. A handful of troops, no air support, minimal ammunition, and yet no one backed down. Even the prisoners, once powerful politicians, took up arms. Borotra, the tennis champion, demanded a rifle. General Gamelin offered tactical advice. Even Édouard Daladier, once the French prime minister, prepared for a fight. As night fell, the sound of boots and gunmetal echoed through the forest. Then, gunfire. The siege had begun. Bullets tore into the stone walls. The tank answered with thunderous blasts. But it was only one gun. The SS had numbers, firepower, and rage. Hours passed. The defenders held their ground, but the situation was unraveling. The tank was knocked out. Ammunition dwindled. Lee and Gangl moved between positions, shouting orders and boosting morale. Every man knew they wouldn't survive the next assault. Then Borotra stepped forward again. He didn't ask permission. He volunteered to break out. Vaulting the castle wall like he was on center court at Wimbledon, the aging athlete sprinted through the trees, ducking bullets and dodging death. His goal: reach American lines and bring reinforcements. It was his greatest match, and he won. When Lee's reinforcements arrived hours later, the tide turned in an instant. The SS, overwhelmed and exhausted, began to fall back, but not before tragedy struck. Major Gangul, who had once sworn allegiance to the Third Reich, was shot by a sniper while shielding a French official. He died defending men he'd never met, from enemies he once served beside. His death wasn't in vain. By sundown, the battle was over. The SS had been defeated, the castle saved, the prisoners liberated. And somewhere in that fortress of stone and blood and fire, something rare had happened. Enemies had become brothers. The smoke hadn't even cleared when the silence fell over Castle ITTER. Shell-shocked, half-deafened, and bleeding from cuts and burns, the defenders stood among the rubble and broken stone, trying to process what they had just done. American soldiers who had stormed German bunkers now clasped hands with Wehrmacht troops who had once sworn loyalty to the Führer. French statesmen and generals sat in the courtyard beside Czech laborers and Austrian partisans, weapons in their laps, disbelief in their eyes. They had survived, together. When the final SS prisoner surrendered, face pressed into the dirt, hands trembling above his head, it was over. Not just the battle, but in many ways, the war. One of the last skirmishes on European soil had ended not with flags raised in triumph, but with weary men sharing cigarettes and water, too tired to celebrate. Shortly after the firefight ceased, reinforcements rolled into the valley. American columns, more tanks, more infantry, medics. Captain Lee finally had the support he needed, but it had arrived only after the hardest part was over. And yet, he never complained. He had gambled everything, his command, his men, his life, for a handful of strangers trapped in a castle. And he'd won. The prisoners were evacuated within days. By May 10th, they were back in Paris, survivors of Nazi imprisonment, now free to speak, to write, to live. Many of them would go on to shape post-war France. But none would forget what they witnessed on that mountain. Nor would they forget Major Joseph Gangul. He didn't have to be there. He could have disappeared like so many others, faded into the chaos of defeat, claimed ignorance, waited for absolution. But instead, he chose one last stand. When the sniper's bullet struck him, Gangul wasn't holding a weapon. He was shielding Léon Jouhaux, a French Union leader and Nobel Peace Prize laureate. He died not as a soldier of the Reich, but as a protector of peace. Austria would later honor him as a national hero. Streets bear his name. Monuments mark his grave. But the greatest tribute lies in the fact that, at the end of one of history's darkest chapters, a man raised under tyranny chose sacrifice over silence. And what of Captain Lee? For his actions, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military honor in the United States. But to those who fought beside him, medals meant little. They remembered his calm under fire, the way he rallied strangers like family, the way he refused to leave, even when the odds made no sense. But perhaps the most enduring figure to the public imagination was Jean Borotra. The tennis star turned messenger had vaulted into legend, literally. The image of him leaping over the castle wall, sprinting into enemy territory for help, then returning in uniform to join the final defense. It was the kind of heroism that defied fiction. France never forgot. The Battle of Castle ITTER became a footnote in official military histories. No major strategic objectives, no territory gained or lost. But among historians and soldiers, it became a legend. A tale passed on not because of its scale, but because of its soul. It was the only known instance in the entire war where American and German troops fought side by side. Not by accident, by choice. They didn't fight for flags. They didn't fight for glory. They fought for the lives of a few forgotten captives, trapped in a castle, waiting to die. And in that act, they gave the world a final, fleeting glimpse of what war should never bury: humanity. Long after the uniforms faded and the guns fell silent, Castle ITTER still stands. Its walls carry scars, its halls echo memories, not just of battle, but of brotherhood, of courage, of one impossible day when enemies became allies and strangers became legends. Not because they were ordered to, but because it was right. That is the story of the strangest battle of World War II. That is the story of Castle ITTER,